Okay, so let us do this thing. Here we go. This is the beginning of the rhetorical aspect of writing. So let's just talk about what is rhetoric. It's a weird word. That's one thing. Let's talk about different ways to pronounce. If you have a person who is being rhetorical, they are the rhetor. Then you have rhetoric, which is the thing. And then if you have someone doing something rhetorical, that's different. So we've got rhetoric, rhetor, and rhetorical, in case you're wondering. I don't know that it really matters, but let's talk about what these things mean. It should be noted that has been, as a thing, around for quite some time. Peeps like Plato and Aristotle thought it was cool. They talked about it. Aristotle's probably one of the biggest like classical rhetoric dudes that is highly anthologized. He has something that is literally on rhetoric is the title of it. So he talks about it he's foundational. So there are a lot of different branches of rhetoric as a field of study or as a discipline, really. And so when we talk about it, people will do here. Let's use books, props. Okay, this book's awesome, The Rhetorical Tradition. It'll cover classical times to the present on rhetoric. So you'll get things like Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, and then more modern guys as well, guys like Kenneth Burke, and a number of others. We'll just leave it at that for now, not wanting to go through the whole canon. So just know that rhetoric's been studied for a long time, and there are some patterns that continue to show up. But let's just talk about what is rhetoric. Know that there are a bunch of guys who have talked about it, and they often are some of the bigger philosophers that you've heard about throughout time, partially because rhetoric was one of those key components of the trivium of classical research or classical education, sorry, up until like the 1800s. So the trivium was, if I'm remembering correctly off the top of my head, it was literature, rhetoric, and philology, which is basically like linguistics and grammar and that kind of thing. But it's a lot more than that. Let's nobody get mad at me for that. This video is about what is rhetoric, what is the rhetorical aspect of writing. So here's the big overview. People have studied rhetoric is essentially, if we ask people like, if we use the traditional definitions like Aristotle describes it, most people know rhetoric as the art of discerning the real and the apparent means of persuasion. So a lot of times when we talk about rhetoric, it's linked to this idea of persuasiveness because Aristotle said so. One guy's opinion. People seem to like him. In more modern day pop culture situations, rhetoric, we have two common meanings we're used to that aren't really all that helpful. One is, someone's using political rhetoric. Another is someone's using a rhetorical question. So just to disambiguate or make a distinction between these words, a rhetorical question is a question you ask not really expecting an answer, but because you have a purpose behind asking it. So it actually makes sense if you think about it that way, but rhetoric is much bigger than just rhetorical questions. Please don't get them mixed up. Political rhetoric actually does tie back to Aristotelian rhetoric and that classical tradition because essentially this idea of rhetoric was born in the Greek agora, which is kind of this political realm of Greek society where all of the Greek male landowners were able to come and be active participants in the politics and governance of the culture, making laws, defending people, doing courts and trials and stuff, all that fun stuff. This is like the fast gloss. I'm just trying to give you some history. It is important to note where that comes from because when we get into types of rhetorical structuring or rhetorical macrostructures in the classical Greek rhetorical form in comparison to other forms, it becomes really important to know that history because it changes the way we might view what counts as effective writing or what counts as effective communication or what counts as effective rhetoric in the Western culture of Europe and the U.S. It'll be important. So it's good to know that history. It comes from a bunch of Greeks. In that culture, only male landowning people got to talk politically, essentially, and the way that they spoke was what Aristotle was discussing as rhetoric and whatnot. There were a bunch of schools back then, like sophists, and anyways, not for the time. So most people know rhetoric or think of rhetoric as the means of persuasion or the art of discerning the real and apparent means of persuasion. Um, that is a form of rhetoric, but really it's if you want a more modern definition, publication in 2018 by Fields and Matsuda in as a chapter on advanced rhetoric and socially situated writing. They describe it as rhetoric is the leveraging of discourse or patterns of understanding to accomplish a socially impactful communicative purpose. Essentially, a better definition of rhetoric is not just simply persuasiveness, even though there are people who have made whole books out of everything being an argument or everything making a claim. But sometimes your goal isn't to make a claim. Sometimes it is to just inform and see what people do with it. Sometimes you don't know what claim to make. Sometimes your goal is just to ask a question and see what happens. And so for it to be persuasive, you could say that asking a question is a persuasive act. If you're asking a question to convince people to redirect a conversation, you can make a case for it. I'm not really trying to hammer all the points or say that that's wrong completely, but I think we need to have a broader definition of rhetoric that is more encompassing. So when I discuss the rhetorical aspect of writing, we're dealing with how a writer accomplishes their purpose, or how they leverage what they know to accomplish their writerly purpose, whatever that purpose is. And so we'll talk a little bit about purpose as well. So when we talk about rhetoric, though, it's essentially how we leverage what we know to accomplish some sort of purpose, or how we deal with communication, often speech communication, not just writing, and it's often involving rhetorical context, rhetorical ecologies, and that sort of thing. So essentially, though, if just for a base definition, know that basics rhetoric's been around for a while. A bunch of people have talked about it. Really cool people, really cool philosophers. There are actually more modern branches of rhetoric and rhetorical practices that kind of start complicating things or challenging Western canon and that kind of thing. So we've got things like rhetoric in the flesh, which looks at how it's a professional technical writing. It's ATTW, so they're cool like that. But it looks at how even things like cadavers speak or have a message. It's interesting. And other kind of how technical documents have this communication of their own. There's Tom Rickart's book, Ambient Rhetoric, or the Attunements of Rhetorical Being. This has to do with like the rhetoric of stuff and how things, objects, can produce messages. So that's kind of an interesting modern spin on things. I'm doing this flyby. One of my favorites, though, is Feminist Rhetorical Practices. One of the reasons I like this is because I am a big fan of rhetorical practices that try and use collaboration or teamwork, or things that are less confrontational, because I think that tends to be more effective in the long run. A lot of Western rhetorical practices based on Aristotelian kind of Western masculine aggressive argument and speech and debate is all about winning the argument, winning the debate, proving the other person wrong. And a lot of times the other person isn't completely wrong. And so they have some really good points we need to take into account. And so feminist rhetorical practices, Rogerian models, things that help you not just win the battle of that one debate or that one argument, but truly convince someone or truly walk someone through something. Some of those other rhetorical practices I tend to prefer. So there's some other things that might be considered rhetoric aside from just traditional Western rhetoric of the Greek model. There are also people doing things like on global rhetorics and rhetorics of cultures other than English-speaking cultures, other than white Western European situation things. So keep that in mind. Rhetoric is really big. Essentially, as far as it goes when I'm talking 8 aspects of writing, rhetoric is how a writer leverages what they know to accomplish their communicative purpose, or how someone leverages what they know to accomplish their writerly purpose, usually in a socially impactful way. So that's the basics. Some components of the rhetorical include, but are not limited to, a lot of these things you'll see in textbooks, so this isn't anything wow or amazing, but I will zoom in on them in other videos and so that you get an idea. I'm going to give the full layout. But when we talk about rhetoric, you might hear things like genre, purpose, exigence, topic and scope, stance and voice, audience, writing customs, constraints or limitations, even technologies. Essentially, when it comes to rhetoric, There are rhetorical principles, there are rhetorical practices, but it really comes down to what are you doing? What knowledge do you have that you're taking, that you're using to your advantage to accomplish some sort of purpose? Hopefully, it's an ethically sound purpose, but there's a point where rhetorically, as a writer, as a rhetor, you have an ethical responsibility just as a human being to not be a jerk and to communicate things that are accurate, true, and beneficial to society. But that's really more of a sociocultural consideration. So when we talk about rhetorical practices, I'm just going to introduce them as here are good things to do, and then hopefully you will go and use that knowledge in a positive and community building way, and not to be a jerk to other people. So that's always the challenge with rhetoric, is you get people who are really good rhetors, really good speakers, really effective rhetorically, but what they're selling or what they're promoting or the way they're going about it, it may get audience buy-in, but it tends to do damage. And so you want to be careful with any of these rhetorical practices when we're trying to analyze the rhetoric of other people, or when we're trying to develop effective rhetorical practices on our own, when we're dealing with audience, when we're dealing with topic or exigence. It is possible for us to misuse and abuse these practices, but rhetoric in and of itself, the practices of rhetoric, when we're dealing with what's my purpose, what's my exigence, the ethical nature of those we want to be aware of. But as far as these videos go, I'm just going to tell you how to be effective. I'm going to try and make you more effective rhetorically, and you will hopefully use these techniques to critically discern other people's rhetoric and ideas and all that fun stuff. All right, so again, key components of rhetoric. Well, it's got a long history, especially in the Western culture. But those key components: purpose, exigence, topic, scope, stance of voice, visual design, genre, audience, writing, customs, constraints, and many, many more. But for now, that's a basic introduction to rhetoric. There are some really great textbooks on it, and I will be giving individual videos on specific concepts as we go along. So hopefully this gives you a basic introduction, just to kind of get you warmed up into it, or to know what you're going to be looking at. Have a wonderful day.